What's up, everyone? It's Adar coming at you with another episode of Startup Engineering Daily. Let's hop right into it. So our first tweet is from this guy, Tane, who's a partner at Wing VC. I haven't heard of them, but he's covering a very interesting blog from Cursor from about 2 weeks ago, talking about dynamic context discovery. And essentially what he's saying here is that providing fewer details up front, making it easier for the agent to pull relevant context on its own is super important. And I thought it was really fascinating because I've been thinking about this a lot and debating it with my colleagues, which is like, do you want to give it context? And it's also kind of like Cursor versus Claude Code, where it's like with Cursor, you can select certain lines and then feed it into the chat, right? Whereas with Claude Code, like you can kind of do that, but you don't have the IDE, the file viewer, It's more like telling you what to do based on what it tells you. So it is very interesting. I am definitely more on the side of providing fewer details. I try to make it specific about the decisions being made, but in terms of implementation details or like where I want it to look, it's usually pretty good at using the search to find it. And I'm still trying to understand if it's using vector search or it's just using grep or some kind of combination of the two in Claude Code and Cursor. But my guess is that it's using just kind of like it's generating the search terms using the LLM, but then I think it's just using grep and, searching multiple cases. So that's where it might not be able to find things if we don't actually like give it the specific lines. But in terms of things being like correctly named, and that's where it speaks to like all the old principles that were super important for naming functions, making APIs like reusable and composable and atomic are all coming back like in full force with the LLMs, and it kind of is like a self-reinforcing cycle. With the cleaner code you have, the better it'll be able to act on it. Next is a tweet from Guillermo where he's talking about this product, Blackbox AI. It looks like a new product, but if you go to their website, they say they have 30 million plus people trusting it. So that's very interesting. But essentially what Guillermo's saying is it's an API that abstracts over and manages every major coding agent for you. So it has like Claude Code, it has Codex and Gemini. And what you can do as well is you can run them all at once. And they have like this chairman LLM is what they call it, that will review all the different options from each agent and what they developed. And it'll compare all the different solutions that each agent generated, so Claude Code versus Codex and Gemini, and it'll suggest to you which one it thinks is the best. And also it's cool because they have their own model. I guess it's called Blackbox Pro. I don't know if it's just an amalgamation of multiple of them, but all the other models, it seems like you are just getting the direct IO on the token pricing. So that's really cool. They're not charging a markup on top. And it is interesting too because Guillermo talks about the auto-fixing code review and testing. I'm not sure if for that he means like running a different model for each of those steps because, I have been working on like a workflow system using LLMs, of course, like everyone else. But I don't know if I should just run Opus 4.5 on everything, and kind of like just eat the cost, or maybe Sonnet 4.5 on everything, or like having like, oh, here's the model that's for, documentation review. Here's the model for sending messages or something like that. So I'm still trying to figure that out, but I'm probably just going to use one model and just see how well it works because, with Claude Code, it's all Opus 4.5, and I'm just super impressed with it overall. Next, we have this tweet from Dylan Mulroy. I wasn't sure exactly at first what this was, if it was part of like some spec kit or something, but it seems to just be a prompt that he wrote about like designing sprints and tasks. Hopefully it's kind of easy to see, but if not, I can explain it. He's basically saying every task/ticket should be atomic. He actually wants projects broken down into sprints and tasks. Like he's saying, how would you do it? Timeline info does not need included. So I guess there's some typos and stuff, but it is very interesting because you look at like sprints and tickets and like Kanban is kind of making its way back because how are you going to say something takes 2 weeks if you can just run a bunch of agents and the blocker is only the code review, And there's another tweet from a CodeRabbit engineer, maybe one of the founders, where he was talking about how AI is going to be reviewing all code. I'm not going to cover that, but I don't agree with that. I think that is kind of like the blocking piece is the code review at the very end. But how are you going to say something's going to take 2 to 4 weeks when you could just have agents running and essentially you just need to be reviewing code all day and making suggestions back and forth? And that is kind of like a workflow difference. And it's so interesting, like pre-AI, how nobody cared about code review. And one of my colleagues has talked about that to me. And it's like, it's kind of a meme back in the day how people wouldn't review code at all. But now it's like the only important piece because how much output we're getting from these agents is unreal. But continuing, he's saying every sprint should result in a demoable piece of software that can be run, tested, and built on top of previous work/sprints. So that is kind of interesting. And that also speaks to like, setting up epics versus stories versus subtasks. But it's so interesting because with those primitives, it's like the human has to go back and forth, and like making the wrong decision with setting it up is such a burden of like having to go back and edit different stories and change them around. But it's almost like with LLMs and with chat, it gives you so much more flexibility to let it figure out like what should the hierarchy be of this, how should these PR stack, do they even need to stack, and it can just like reorganize and create or delete cards as needed. So that's what's so cool about it. Like the Jira kind of flow of epic stories and subtasks, I do really think there is like a lot of benefits to letting LLMs handle that, and that'll be kind of as well with stacking and like greptile and all that, where they think because stacked PRs are kind of hard to learn that people don't want to do it, but now that LLMs can just do it with Git commits and like run the Git commands itself, then we can give it like much harder, but like more improved systems, which I totally agree with as well. Whenever I want to like figure out where something went wrong in like Git history, or if we merged something bad or where it came from or how it used to be, the commands that Claude Code comes up with to like check the Git history is so unreal. And like you would have had to be like an insane Git legend to know how to like create those queries and all that off the cuff. And at the very least, you'd have to look at Stack Overflow and just pray. And then the super last piece is just how it says always focus on small atomic tasks. That's where it's like, these stories, like how big do they need to be? But it does just make sense. You want to have it as small as possible because then you can see progress. If you have a story sitting for too long, more than like a day or so, then it's probably too big. As I think about it, that's probably what makes the most sense. Next, we have a quick one from Greg Brockman, kind of funny, like bouncing off of yesterday's where he was talking about all the crazy stuff with Elon. But GPT 5.2 Pro has solved another open, I don't know how to pronounce it, but I guess Erdos problem. And I guess it's a list of problems from this guy in the 80s, I want to say, or the 1900s, I believe. And there was a post previously about how ChatGPT had solved one of them. But when I read more into it, it seemed that it was more of like a suggestion. And Terrence Tao, who's like known as one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, and I believe he's American, he kind of responded to the first one and was like, okay, this is an interesting idea, but let's see the actual proof, is kind of my take on what the replies were to that. But this one seems to be fully concluded that it was the correct solution. And his comment essentially said, perhaps the most unambiguous instance of AI solving an open problem. That's really cool. But he also said in his comment that it was actually like obvious, like there's a certain problem that had been solved at the time and that Erdos like must have knew about. And apparently like once you know about that problem, then this problem specifically 281 becomes super easy to solve. So that's really interesting as well, because it kind of speaks to like being able to comb over all that context and know everything. Whereas, sometimes you just miss these things, even if you're apparently supposed to know it, is kind of what Terrence Tao was saying. Here we have a tweet from David Holtz, I guess how you say his name, Holtz, where I kind of got this from like one of the Twitter like stories where it was kind of like a grok summarization, because this tweet is hard to read, but he says the purely linear, non-differential, non-branching, non-layered UI paradigms around LLMs is such a curse, saying that we've lost quote unquote cognitive infrastructure beyond oral communication. So essentially what that's been taken to mean is that he doesn't like the chat interfaces with LLMs. And it's very interesting because I would say about like 6 months ago, I was very much on the wave of like every app just kind of becomes a chat, You tell it what to do. It's like Jarvis, Everyone's trying to get to Jarvis as soon as possible, which is essentially AGI via assistant chat. But it's very interesting what David is saying is that actually the abstractions that we've created with UI, with buttons, with mouse clicks, etc., adds layers to the oral communication, and we've solved for a lot of these quote unquote infrastructure problems. And that's very interesting and kind of speaks to like, the Kanbans are coming back, and like you need visualization, of course, of UI. And that's where it's like you have the embeds directly in the chat to show you information, like those old demos of like stock chart prices that you could ask for in a chat. So I'm not sure what he thinks about that, but it is very interesting to think that like chat is probably not the future. I remember I was talking to someone, I just met them randomly, but they, I guess, were interested in AI as well at the time, and they definitely disagreed with my understanding that everything was going to become a chat. So they're kind of with David on this, but I'm like, action happens through communication, So if you're communicating with a mouse click to click this button, it's just so fixed and static compared to language, which is so like dynamic, and what LLMs excel at like grabbing the context from what you're saying, which speaks to like the cursor story that we covered earlier, which was saying that like you give it less context and let it do the search itself, then it can solve a lot of the problems on its own. Here we just have like another gimmick project, but it's pretty cool. So kind of like how Riley Waltz created the Gmail and the Google Drive for all the Epstein files, this guy Marcus created like an Apple Mail, but it has all the inboxes of the people in the OpenAI versus, or like the Musk versus Altman lawsuit. And it's really cool. Like you can see all the emails, like as if you were Elon or as if you were Sam, coming to and from, and you can see exactly how they were talking. It's so interesting. Like that Twitter account, Internal Tech Emails, was way ahead of the game. But you know, these guys just talk like normal people. But when they're doing interviews and stuff, they really like keep it wrapped, you know. But it's really interesting to see behind the curtain. You know, like we all talk like people. Like we all just have things to do. Like I remember there was one email where Elon was like, yeah, I have a few meetings, but then, you know, we can chat. And I think they said at 11. I don't know if it was 11 a.m. or 11 p.m., but I think in the email, like, I don't know how the time zones work, but it said 5 a.m. So it's just crazy if, like, they're up all night, you know, just doing meetings and just delegating. But, like, that's the job, you know, fundraising, all these different things. Or engineering, I guess, as well. And I would wonder, like, how much of this was made with AI, because, like, these gimmick projects are so easy to do. Like, I don't know what Riley feels about it or this guy Marcus, but it is really cool that you can have just like so much flexible UI and stuff, you know? Okay, and the last story is we have Greg Foster, who was the co-founder and CTO of Graphite, which has now been acquired by Cursor. And he's talking about the stacking workflow, quote unquote. I'm still looking into this, and it's kind of interesting. Like coincidentally, I had just learned about this essentially, where like if you stack PRs on top of each other and then you merge the one that's facing into the base branch, then the one that's PRing into the one that just got merged is now pointing at the base branch. So you kind of get that like that quality of life improvement there. But with Graphite, I guess it has like this whole stacking flow. It was pretty basic when I looked at the docs. Like essentially all it doesn't have to do is like do git checkout B to create the new branch. You can just kind of do like git stack essentially, or GT stack, and you can create like a prefix and all that. So it is kind of just like quality of life improvements. But it's interesting because with AI and kind of like the second point he's saying here, where engineers won't have to think about git commands, like I said earlier, I just think that Claude Code and LLMs, I guess in general, are so good at running these super detailed git commands, especially when they're trying to look through git history or figure out like where something broke or where something got merged or didn't get merged. They're so good at doing these crazy detailed queries. So I wonder if we even need like the simplified CLI commands that Graphite offers when the LLMs are just so good at Git. This kind of stuff interests you and you want to talk with some like-minded people, join the Audinato Discord in the description. Thanks.